It made shockingly little commotion in the US media when on August 26, 2025, President Donald Trump said, "The line is that I'm a dictator, but I stop crime." So a lot of people say, if that's the case, I'd rather have a dictator. Before adding, "But I'm not a dictator, I just know how to stop crime." This is not the first time that Trump has done this
sarcastic
soft pitching of the idea of him becoming a dictator, a king, no longer being subject to elections, or some combination of these thoughts. And in light of some of these statements, going back as far as his first run for office in 2016, there's been a lot of discourse about democracy among the people who would really prefer not to live in a Trump dictatorship. At first, that debate in those early years was centered on what has gone so wrong in the US and in our electoral system that someone talking like this could even be viable as a candidate. But since Trump's 2024 election win, that debate has shifted markedly into a debate about tactics. How do you prepare for an election when the people who are supposed to certify and accept the results of that election can't be trusted? And where do you start with trying to remove a regime that has already crossed that Rubicon? What kind of non-violent mass mobilization is effective, and when do you just have to rip the band-aid off and move into protracted armed struggle? I want to make an effort to bridge some of the divides that exist among the people who know things can't continue to go the way they're going, but who often disagree quite a bit on what kind of action needs to be taken. And we're going to do that by grounding things in historical experience rather than trying to reinvent the wheel here. There have been so many mass movements to change a government throughout history that we can reflect on as examples, and quite a spectrum of outcomes. But we're going to focus on one example where highly organized mass mobilization led to an electoral landslide that knocked a regime on its back, and then consider how our situation differs from theirs, and try to adapt our tactics accordingly. Which means today we're going to be talking about Kwame Nkrumah and the Ghanaian Revolution. So let's set the stage with some context so we understand what we're looking at here. African history is woefully underrepresented in American and European education, and I suspect that many of y'all have never heard of Kwame Nkrumah. I never heard his name in a classroom my entire academic life, despite taking a lot of classes in political science, economics, foreign policy, and history, and he really should have come up at least once in all of that. So if the stories I'm about to tell you are all news to you, don't sweat it, it's not your fault. From 1821 to 1957, Ghana was a British colony known as the Gold Coast. And while gold was far from the only thing the British were taking from Ghana, just by the name, I think you can imagine how much value the British were able to steal from Ghana in their 136-year pillaging spree. You can find out more about the effects of European plundering in Africa in Walter Rodney's book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. But I'm not going to go down that road here because we're here to talk about revolutionary tactics. I hope that you already know that colonialism is one of the most dehumanizing and brutal conditions that one group of people can impose on another. So we shouldn't really need to expound on that here. After over a century of this subjugation and inhuman treatment, Ghanaians were absolutely fed up with the British imposition, and World War II was the breaking point that led to Ghanaian independence. And there are a few reasons why this was the case. One is material. The war made it basically impossible for the British and French to exert material control over their empires any longer. They were overextended even before the war, and the loss of hundreds of thousands of fighting-age men and billions of dollars worth of armaments made the prospect of bringing force to bear in any one of their colonies effectively impossible after 1945. And the French learned this in much harder and bloodier ways than the British did. They tried to reimpose their control on Indochina, now known as Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, in the early 1950s, and they were beaten decisively at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, and forced to accept the independence of those countries. By the end of that year, the French were fighting another independence movement in Algeria. And while Vietnam was half a world away, Algeria was considered a part of France at that point, and losing control there was considered unfathomable to the French colonial regime. They doubled down on a vicious war in Algeria, and by the early 1960s, all of France's major colonies had won their independence. The British were just as overextended as the French at this point, but certain key factors led the British to deal with things differently. India and Pakistan forced their way out of the British Empire in 1947. and there was simply no option for the British but to relinquish control there. India was multiple times the size of Britain, and to fight a war to continue the occupation would have decimated the British military and left them totally exposed in Africa and the Caribbean. Letting go of India without a military struggle was in large part a tactical move by the British in order to shore things up in its remaining empire. And through their experience in India, the British managed to learn quite a bit about how to court certain factions within their colonies and groom them for power. But on the flip side, Ghanaian revolutionaries like Kwame Nkrumah were watching what happened in India and learning how to be effective in their opposition to the British. The other big reason colonialism had to break after World War II is ideological and sociological. World War II was probably the most ideologically centered war of all time, and the amount of propaganda that was pushed on all sides was unprecedented. Most war propaganda up to that point had been pretty simplistic. We're good and holy, and they're evil and brutish. You know the routine. But this usually didn't need to get into any kind of great detail. It depended on you to side impulsively with your nation or ethnic group or religious sect. And that usually doesn't require a manifesto to convince you of whose side you were on. It was propaganda to rile you up and get you itching to fight, rather than to get ideological buy-in. The Second World War, though, was a fight to the death between communism, liberalism, and fascism. And it wasn't just fought between nations. In most of the nations involved in the war, all three of these sides were present at home. Communist insurgents were the main people fighting the government in Germany and Italy, as well as in occupied France. Communist and fascist organizations fought one another in the street in liberal Britain and in the United States. The Chinese communists and liberals put their civil war aside to fight the invasion of the fascist Japanese Empire. And amid all these multilateral fights, each side was putting out films, radio broadcasts, newspapers, pamphlets, and books defending their ideology and their way of life, by which they really meant their system of government. For liberal Britain and France, this meant trying to differentiate themselves, especially from the fascist Germans and Italians, which meant saying a lot of things that they didn't really mean in the big picture and certainly didn't live by. Oh, you don't believe in a racial hierarchy? All people are created equal? All men are brothers? Liberté, égalité, fraternité? Democracy and self-determination for all people? Sure, Jan. It's pretty obvious why the people subjected to British or French colonialism, like those in Ghana, were attentive to this blatant hypocrisy, though it wouldn't develop into the mass movements that toppled imperialism until the war was over. A lot of folks in the colonies fought alongside the British and French during the war, which became a source of fuel later for the independence movements. The colonial contributions to the war helped break down the myth of colonial inferiority. Colonialism and imperialism are based on a myth that one group of people is somehow superior to another. This myth-making is incredibly flexible and slippery, and it's changed quite a lot in the 5 centuries of European global empire. This was far from the first time imperial mythology had been shattered and needed to regroup. The breakdown of the myths that were used to justify slavery up to the early part of the 19th century was the biggest shift in imperial myth-making prior to the 1950s and 60s. A wave of revolts by the enslaved started in Haiti in 1791 and spread through the British West Indies, leading Britain to abolish slavery in 1833. These revolts demonstrated a level of organization and sophistication among the enslaved that the slavers had insisted was not even possible for Africans. And Haiti in particular showed the Europeans a case of Africans not just banding together to break their chains, but forming a government and ruling themselves after the fact. It shattered the myth of European superiority in a major way, and it made the institutions of slavery untenable across the entire world. The abolition of slavery was then pursued by the British and French as a way of clinging to power and suppressing further rebellion in their colonies. And this marks the transition into the second phase of the superiority myth. Sure, fine, you're people, I guess, but you simply don't have the experience and the education to govern yourselves in a civilized way. So we'll just have to stay and do it for you until we can finish civilizing you. And this was still the dominant myth by World War II. If it sounds like I'm embellishing here, allow me to just quote you an excerpt of a document from the British colonial government in the Gold Coast to the regime in London about why they needed to remain in control of the Gold Coast beyond 1948 in spite of the growing independence movement.
The moral justification for Britain remaining in the Gold Coast lies in this. Out of a population of approximately 4.5 million Africans, on a fair assessment, barely 10% is literate. We have no reason to suppose that power in the hands of a small literate minority would not tend to be used to exploit the illiterate majority in accordance with the universal pattern of what has happened elsewhere in the past throughout the world. His Majesty's government therefore has a moral duty to remain until A. The literate population has, by experience, reached the stage when selfish motivation is no longer the dominant motive of political power. B. The bulk of the population has advanced to such a stage of literacy and political experience as will enable it to protect itself from gross exploitation. And C. Some corresponding degree of cultural, political, and economic achievement has been attained by all three areas now part of the Gold Coast.
Yeah.
It's hard to say which part of this is the most absurd. Remember, Britain had governed Ghana by force for 100 years at this point. So whose fault was it that the literacy rate was only 10%, and that political experience among the population was basically non-existent? And if being governed by a literate minority was a guarantee of exploitation, what does that say about colonialism? Of course, the British kept the population illiterate on purpose to make it easier to exploit them, and to prevent them from advancing to a stage of literacy and political experience as would enable them to protect themselves from gross exploitation. But the one that had me laughing the hardest was definitely the idea that it was Ghana that needed to bypass the stage where, quote, selfish motivation was no longer the dominant motive of political power, as though Britain has ever attained such a state of enlightenment. It's truly upside down and delusional stuff, but this was what the myth-making of white supremacy and colonialism looked like on the eve of the revolution in Ghana. Ghanaians, whether they were British educated scholars or illiterate farmers, knew that they were capable of self-governance every bit as much as the British, and that it was their fundamental human right to govern themselves whether the British liked it or felt them capable of it or not. Ghanaian soldiers fought in Burma and Ethiopia during the war, some of whom were drawn to volunteer for the military because they believed in the struggle of democracy, however flawed and imperialistic, versus the tumor of fascism, and to a large extent because they believed that fighting would make it easier to gain independence by showing their own capacity and getting some military training in the process. And by the war's end, Ghanaian administration had grown within the Gold Coast as the British had fully mobilized their colonies for the war effort. So more than ever, Ghanaians and people in every British colony were participating heavily in their government and economy, even though they remained under colonial rule. Just as the Haitian Revolution had made slavery more and more impossible to maintain, war-era Ghana made post-war Ghana ungovernable for the British. The myth was irreparably broken. Okay, so now that we've established a bit of historical context, I think we can start to get into the tactical meat that y'all came here for. Over the course of about 4 years, we can see more or less every kind of non-violent political tactic deployed by the Ghanaian people in some capacity. Starting with the boycott against European imports in early 1948, the march on the colonial governor's residence also in early 48, and a general strike in the summer of 1950, culminating in a landslide election victory by Kwame Nkrumah and the Convention People's Party in 1951. And the most important thing to know is that this was all made possible by organic organization of the people by the people. The two main parties we're going to look at, the United Gold Coast Convention and its radical successor, the Convention People's Party, contributed to organizing and mobilizing the people as well. But especially early on, we have to recognize that key movements were coordinated by smaller and looser organizations, which the national movement was then able to connect with and build on later. This is the first crucial tie-in to our current political moment. The Democratic and Republican parties are clubs. They are organized by the power of money, which is unfortunately the most powerful organizing tool around. Any kind of politics and organization is built on a foundation of people's time and effort, and a group that can pay people for that has a huge head start over those who can't. The cash that big party donors pump into their coffers is what gives them the ability to direct your attention, and the spectrum they get to define is what constitutes politics. We have to have a working class mass movement right now, because parties organized by money aren't going to offer a real resistance. They'll go along with fascism and dictatorship so long as things stay profitable. If you're waiting to vote for a Democrat or waiting for the Democrats to lead a mass movement against Donald Trump by any other means than a Gavin Newsom Twitter barrage, you are going to be disappointed. If you're waiting for Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger, Mitt Romney, and the Lincoln Project to retake the Republican Party, I'm not even sure there are any of y'all anymore, but that ain't gonna happen either. We need to defeat and ultimately abolish these two parties, which are puppets for the rich and traitors to every working class person in this country. But even if you still hold the position that somehow they could be captured and or reformed, you're still subject to this point about independent organization and mass mobilization too. Because it's not like either party's leadership is gonna help you change the agenda, or move their positions on any serious issue, or remove and replace obstinate or tyrannical leadership. We have to force them, and the only way to do so is to organize people effectively outside of their control, so that we have something to bargain with, or enough people power to seize the levers of power ourselves. Without independent organization, there is nothing. And calling for people to focus their efforts on actions that work within those parties is wasteful of people's time and effort, laughable in its logic, and ultimately counterproductive. We can see some of these lessons in our Ghanaian case study over the course of 1947 and 48. The United Gold Coast Convention was Ghana's first major independence party. And like many decolonial parties, its leadership was drawn heavily from highly educated and well-connected families within the colony. There are a few reasons why this tended to happen. One is that the colonizer tended to push things that direction as much as they could. Like we said earlier, Britain controlled Ghana for over a century and only managed to achieve about 10% literacy by the late 1940s. They wanted a small literate class among the people in Ghana who they could draw on as administrators and bureaucrats to limit their own costs of bureaucracy, because hiring locals was cheaper than sending educated Brits out into the colonies. And as the most likely to be in power after de-colonization, this literate minority often made up the main conservative force among independence movements. They wanted to proceed with caution towards independence, because they wanted to inherit a functional economy rather than a mess. The UGCC was formed in 1947 in opposition to a constitution ratified in 1946, which maintained nearly absolute control for the colonial governor. But being a relatively elite and conservative organization, the leaders of the UGCC were still only pushing a party line of gradual independence at that time. They wanted more seats on the legislative and executive councils that had the ear of the colonial governor. They weren't pushing for immediate independence. It's important to note how the UGCC took a position that they considered practical. Ghana was still ahead of the liberation curve when they reached total independence in 1957. So in 1947, they were even further ahead of the curve just for having such a developed independence movement at all. India couldn't be held back anymore at that point, but in the late 40s, the Ghanaians had little reason to believe that there wouldn't be a major British counterinsurgency there if they tried to fight their way out. So while the UGCC was focused on negotiating a gradual path towards independence, the organic movements building among the masses weren't interested in a timetable to eventually move towards independence. They wanted it now. There were some groups within the country who in particular played a large role in organizing and spreading the ideas of liberation. These included traders, mostly women whose position in the markets throughout the country made them key disseminators of information. They occupied a space between the European and Arab merchants delivering goods and the tens of thousands of Ghanaians who came to the markets to shop. In a society that still had such a low literacy rate, the market women were a crucial word-of-mouth source of information, and they would come to play a major role many times in the revolution, helping to direct the people as events were unfolding. Local clan chiefs were another group who played a key role. especially in the first event that we need to look at, which is the January 1948 boycott of European imports. There was a post-war inflation and food shortage which the colonial regime did basically nothing to rectify, something that really heightened the anger of another key group, the war veterans and their families. Ghana had given a lot in the war in both men and materials, and Ghanaian troops, like other colonial troops, were often subjected to some of the harshest conditions of war. They were sent on some of the most dangerous missions and were used as cannon fodder to take out artillery and machine gun positions, at a very high cost to their units. Ghanaians would have been well within their rights to expect the British to improve conditions in the colony in light of their sacrifices. So instead, to return home to worsening economic conditions like inflation and high unemployment was a considerable factor in kicking off the entire independence movement. A local sub-chief in Accra, the capital of Ghana, named Kwame Nkrumah III, recognized the conflict brewing and decided to coordinate a boycott of the European imports. And the way Bon spread word of this boycott is crucial to the story as a whole. Trucks, or lorries as the British and Ghanaians called them, had rapidly become more common in Ghana in the early 40s. Automobiles were a massive factor in unifying the common people throughout the colony for the first time, along with radios. Bon was able to ride around the country meeting with chiefs and convincing them of the need for a boycott. Even just a decade earlier, only the colonizers would have had access to transport like this. And a chief carrying a subversive plan around the country by lorry would have just been impossible. Kwame Nkrumah followed this path later to build that movement out even further. For over a month, the people pulled off a near total boycott of European imports, which devastated the colonial merchants and forced the government's hand into agreeing to lower prices eventually. This is where layers of organization and mobilization come into focus, because we don't really know if the chiefs would have stopped pushing after winning concessions from the government and forcing prices down. But the fact that some of the chiefs had organized a boycott didn't place them at the head of the entire movement. Just 2 weeks after that boycott ended, the ex-servicemen's union planned a march to the residence of the colonial governor to present a list of demands, mostly about the economic conditions as well as their pensions. This march ended in atrocity and calamity, as colonial police and soldiers fired upon the crowd, killing 2 marchers and wounding several more. News of this hit the markets, and this was only days after folks had started to buy European goods again. This led to the Accra riots, an uprising where thousands took to the streets to smash European storefronts and loot the overcharged goods still being sold there. And while a riot isn't generally a highly coordinated act, the level of discipline displayed during the Accra riots is pretty notable. People busting out windows to take food when they're hungry don't always show much discernment about who they're taking from. But in Accra, the material damage was dealt almost exclusively to the European merchants. And while not coordinated, it makes a lot of sense why things would play out this way. The boycotts had only just ended a few days ago, against the exact kind of stores and warehouses that got looted. The population knew where to hit in retaliation for the killing of their countrymen by the colonial police, whether they were guided to do so or not, and this was not lost on the British. They targeted leadership in the national liberation organizations, including Kwame Nkrumah, with arrest, despite Nkrumah having no role even in the boycott, let alone in the riots. Because whether the riot was coordinated or not was irrelevant. The people raising the consciousness of the masses were responsible for the discipline on display during the uprising, which is why they went after Nkrumah anyway. These levels of organization, discipline, and consciousness are very important to draw a connection to when it comes to our current situation. The discipline in the Accra uprisings reminds me of some of the discipline on display in the LA uprisings earlier this year. Specifically the calling of self-driving Waymo vehicles to be torched. There was no national or local organization directing this tactic. The people doing it just knew how to differentiate who was a class enemy and thus a political enemy and who wasn't. They didn't torch the cabs of regular working drivers in LA. They didn't go after the city's buses. They went for cars with no drivers, owned by a corporation disconnected from the community, and like most of big tech, is aligned with the regime. This kind of discipline is crucial for advancing struggle against the oppressor without alienating the other people in our class. And we can see parallels between LA and Accra in the way that official opposition, the UGCC in Ghana, and the local and state Democrats in Los Angeles, were both accused by their respective regimes of organizing actions that they could not and would not organize. In both cases, the hierarchical organizations wanted to exploit the mass uprising to gain concessions from the regime. But they also feared being scapegoated and suppressed in response to the unrest. And they feared mass mobilization and organization that they couldn't control, because that represents a threat to their power. As a result of the boycott's success, the organized masses soon moved beyond the UGCC and formed a more aggressive party to direct the movement for independence, the Convention People's Party, led by Kwame Nkrumah. And the experiences that they gained from the boycott, the Servicemen's March, and the uprisings, as well as the connections that they developed between one another during these tribulations, gave them the organization, the experience, and the confidence to demand self-government now. This demand for immediate independence, rather than continuing to pursue a strategy of incrementalist transfer of power, is precisely what led to the split between the UGCC and the CPP. Nkrumah was pushed to leave the UGCC by the masses in the summer of 1949. History is often told through the prism of something called the Great Man Theory, which tends to place the ownership of massive political and social shifts onto a single person or maybe a small group of people who were in prominent positions during these shifts. And Nkrumah is a great example of that. His role as a teacher and a leader was crucial, but we can see in the summer of 1949 that he was being pulled by the people more than he was pulling them. And I think this is really important for us to look at as an example of how hard we need to be pulling right now. Contrast this mass line driven version of politics with the tactics of California Governor Gavin Newsom. It looks to me like Newsom is preparing a run for president in 2028. And the way he's doing that is by tweeting in the same deranged style as Donald Trump to prove some kind of point, I guess? I've seen a lot of defensiveness about Newsom in light of his rise to fame as a leader against Trump, none of which seems to be about his material actions or a rising level of organization under his direction. He seems like an early Democratic frontrunner for 2028, and for a lot of people, that's enough to warrant uncritical support, and to police anyone else being critical of him out of fear of his brand being ruined. In US politics, we've normalized things being a popularity contest. And right now, if you speak ill of Gavin for tearing up homeless camps with his bare hands and not doing anything to help them, or his increasingly negative statements about trans people, you will get dogpiled by liberals asking,
"Well, who else do you have in mind?"
As though the answer to any of our problems comes in the form of some singular who. This whole approach to politics is a dead end that hitches all our hopes onto one person or a small group of people to do the right things, both tactically and morally. But in a system where our politics is run by these clubs for the rich, that's never going to work out. This clinginess in electoral politics comes directly from our inability to build mass organized movements. Political power and momentum is rooted entirely in money and optics, and that makes most people who have very little money to contribute feel that their main political duty is the defense of the optics of the parties and candidates they support. This level of dependency just feeds these politicians' egos and their entitlement to get away with everything they do wrong. It's a recipe for a total lack of self-criticism that we find within our politics. And you know all the usual arguments. Well, who else is there to vote for? No other party can be in a position to win in such a short period of time. By criticizing the Democrats, you're just dividing the opposition. Are you trying to lose again? This purity testing stuff isn't helping anyone. Politics is like a bus, and you just need to take the first one going in the general direction you're headed in. We've heard this all before, election after election. But it's especially worrying to see people still unable to break this habit, even when they know there's a real risk that the next election result could be ignored or thrown out by this administration or Congress. In the 1951 election, Kwame Nkrumah and the CPP knew the British didn't have to accept the outcome if they didn't like it. An election win could prove a point, but it wasn't a guarantee that you would win anything tangible or lasting. In a situation like that, the number one thing to keep in mind is that you cannot depend on any one thing to work, be it a boycott or a march or a general strike or an election. Think of all these things together as a kind of checklist that you mark off before revolutionary struggle becomes necessary and unavoidable. But before you can make a pass at that checklist, You have to develop the kind of organization that we've talked about already. Organization will form the backbone of all these other actions, and for that reason, it makes much more sense to center the discussion on a general strike and not elections. General strikes and revolutions are basically conjoined for several key reasons. Materially, an organization which is prepared for a general strike is prepared for a revolution in every respect, except maybe the acquisition of arms. They both require strong organizations that can mobilize and direct their existing membership while developing new membership on the fly. That means having some level of bureaucracy. It means being able to spread information, both publicly and privately. And it means having the tactical knowledge to move the masses in the right directions in a disciplined way. And on top of all of that, you have to manage complex logistics. You need to stockpile food and medicine and clothing and prepare backup housing in order to meet the needs of the people and the movement as the action starts to cause negative repercussions to the people, even people who aren't involved. The less you're able to ensure for the people during a strike or a revolution, the easier it is for the regime to provide relief, isolating your movement from the masses. And because a general strike is so close in its nature to a revolution, a government will always perceive the breakout of a general strike in a nearly identical way as they would perceive a fully fledged revolution, and they respond to it with the same tactics, ranging from propaganda and subterfuge all the way up to breaking your strike with armed force. Which means a general strike is no picnic to be toyed with. It's not a maneuver that a movement can really move backwards from. Once you've reached a point in the breakdown of conditions where a general strike is unavoidably necessary, you must also be prepared to go the rest of the way to a revolution if the strike fails to achieve its goals. Trying to move back from that precipice will tear whatever organization you've built to shreds, as the disillusioned people will walk away from the movement while radical elements move towards guerrilla tactics on their own. Where do elections fit into all of this? Well, this gives us a great litmus test for what kind of political parties are fit for the moment we face. A political party that cannot, or worse yet, will not even try to, organize a general strike is categorically not a viable political party at this moment. Because what are they going to do if the election is rigged or doesn't happen at all? Call the unorganized masses into the streets to protest? Okay, then the government will bring down martial law, and with no functional mass organization and the material support that such an organization must provide, the masses will just flee back into their houses. Whatever small groups start trying to actively fight the regime will be massively outgunned, and their ineffective resistance will be used as a pretext for expanded searches, seizures, surveillance, and apprehensions against everyone else. A party that's organized enough for a general strike can try their hands at elections, boycotts, and all kinds of other tactics. But a party that's only organized to participate in elections is only organized to participate in elections. If you are denying the need for mass organization and waiting to vote for Democrats in 2028, you are placing your entire faith in Donald Trump, the Republicans in Congress, and the Supreme Court to just back down if they lose. Is that a gamble that you want to take? And if you think the overreach of the regime is bad now, consider that they're still moving at a relatively slow pace versus the speed of power consolidation that they'll be moving at if they dismantle the electoral system. Right now they're trying to avoid, and are depending on the lack of, a mass movement, which could shut things down and oppose them on all fronts. They're doing this by targeting a few things at a time. Right now, they're depending on redeploying some of the same assets they had on the ground in LA to DC, and then to Chicago, and so on, which they couldn't do if they needed those assets in all those places at the same time. Election nullification would mean they had to escalate everywhere all at once. Waiting for them to do that and then trying to organize resistance is like trying to put your seatbelt on after the car crash. We need organization right now, and the Democrats don't even have organizing on their radar. They're just playing popularity politics as usual, trying to build up a cult of personality around Newsom and hoping for him to carry the day. This is a catastrophic political blunder, but they don't even realize the trap they're falling into because the kind of machine politics that they practice is the only kind of politics they understand. They cannot fathom what a real mass movement looks like, because the Democratic Party has been practicing since the Civil Rights Movement to subsume and demobilize mass movements when they see them popping up. The Democratic leadership is just as scared of an organized grassroots left that could push them around and make them irrelevant as they are of a Trump dictatorship. And that's the key difference between the Democrats and Nkrumah and the CPP. Nkrumah and his party built power through the mass organization of the people, and continued to expand that power as the party grew in prevalence. When the mass organizations rejected the incrementalist terms the UGCC were pushing for, the people pushed Nkrumah to abandon the UGCC and form the CPP. If Nkrumah had had the same mindset as our Democrats, he would have insisted on holding the UGCC together as the most palatable face of the independence movement, as far as the British saw. The UGCC would have remained the lead independence party at the cost of the cohesion of the mass movement that they were drawing all their real power from. There likely would have been a split between those who insisted on following the elites and their conservative incrementalism, and those who refused to water down their demands. The UGCC would have won the election, but with lower turnout, and with a weak platform that would have empowered the British regime. The colonial government would have been free to cherry-pick leadership, and the UGCC's attempts to work within the colonial framework would have been substantially weakened by the splitting of their own base and the mass movement that their power needed to be derived from to have any impact. It's a backwards and obstinate party that divides the forces of resistance, not the critics of such a party. The CPP split isolated the elite and galvanized the masses. The CPP became even more powerful than the UGCC had ever been after the split. Parties are not ordained by God. Political parties exist to exert the will of their membership, which the Democrats do very well. The problem is that their membership is their donors and not the masses. They're happy to cleave off elements of the masses in order to preserve the agenda of their rich donors. There is nothing there to be saved, and that has to be accepted right now. Destroying a party in order to consolidate the masses into a movement is always a much better strategic move than protecting a party from the will of the masses and disillusioning and scattering the masses as a result. The structural integrity of the Democratic Party isn't even worth considering at this point. They are already gone, and they are awaiting a replacement. Cling to their corpse and you will get buried with it. The 1951 election in Ghana didn't do anything except show how unified the country was against the British, and demonstrate the level of organization and consciousness that had been reached by the people. The level of organization of the people in Ghana gave them the capacity to hold a general strike, and to sweep an election for an independence party. If those things had failed, they would have been well positioned to launch a revolution. A small group of rebels the British might have been able to try their luck with. But with 90% of the population behind Nkrumah and the CPP, organized and disciplined enough to strike, and with the servicemen and all their arms and tactical training on the party's side too, it would have been a war against the entire country of Ghana, and a war the country would have been prepared to fight. And that's why the election results stuck, and why Nkrumah was able to take most of the power away from the colonial governor for the next 6 years until independence was achieved in full. Not because the British were nice, or because they respect the sanctity of election results. The alternative was to refuse to let Nkrumah out of prison and send hundreds of thousands of British troops to Ghana in preparation for the storm that would have followed. The CPP would have been forced into becoming an underground guerrilla movement, and the entire country would have harbored and aided those revolutionary forces against the British troops. And who knows what a full-scale British occupation and war in Ghana would have done throughout the rest of the empire. If that had boomeranged into major solidarity uprisings in Jamaica, Guyana, Nigeria, Kenya, Tanganyika, Ireland. The US's situation today isn't much better than the British in the 50s in terms of being spread too thin. The escalations of ICE raids and the deployment of the National Guard, as we already mentioned, depend right now on hitting LA one week, DC the next, Chicago the next, and so on. They don't have the resources to be effective everywhere all at once. The US is a global empire, meaning a lot of our military, intelligence, and counterinsurgency forces deployed abroad. Bringing it home to deal with a mass uprising and a general strike would expose the vulnerabilities of the network of US-backed puppet regimes and proxies that those forces are deployed to protect. If everybody knows that we don't have the resources to back those proxies up, it could lead to a wave of realignment that reshapes global politics. Now, I'm not saying that Trump or the people in his inner circle would necessarily refrain from trying to consolidate their power anyway. But incurring that kind of cost to the empire would start to tear his coalition apart. The corporations and business elites that he depends on for support would turn on him if their business interests were threatened by a general strike and the weakening of US military force abroad. People very close to him and essential to his power would be loudly in his ear, demanding that he try to head things off by conceding some things to pacify the uprising and split the strikers. If he insisted on making that a military and law enforcement problem anyway, those powers standing behind him might start coming up with a plan to oust him and break the fever caused by the strike. A general strike would incur incalculable political damage against Trump and his coalition. I know general strikes and revolutions can be scary to think about. It feels vaguely illegal to even be discussing this, honestly. But there is no alternative to getting organized right now. We're already late, and any later than now will be too late. And while organizing for such an extreme measure as a general strike might seem like an escalation, it's actually one of the most stabilizing things we can do right now. I think most of us suspect that this isn't going to end with a peaceable transfer of power. Building up the largest and most disciplined network of organization and supplying it to feed and protect the people for at least a period of weeks or months in the event that we need to pull the lever on a general strike is the best way to ensure that the transfer of power away from this regime can be secured with the least chaos and violence possible. A general strike speaks softly and carries a big stick. We have to learn from Kwame Nkrumah and the Ghanaian revolution and work towards a collective power that no regime can deny. One key takeaway is to utilize what networks and institutions we already have in place as starting points instead of trying to reinvent the wheel. Obviously, if we're talking general strike, labor unions are going to be important in that. We're not unionized enough in this country for existing unions to get that job done alone. And existing union leadership is often too conservative and risk-averse to get the job done anyway, which means we need two big moves to happen on that front. Non-union workers need to start getting ready to flip the switch in their workplaces, especially in sectors like the service industry, where unions have been rigorously kept out. You know your own workplace and co-workers. Maybe you're in a position to try to establish union recognition soon, or maybe you're already on that path. Maybe doing so would require a strike for you right out of the gate just to get management talking about recognition. With the larger goal of a general strike being a focal point for all of us, maybe organizing in secret now and waiting for a larger strike is tactically more sound for you and your coworkers than trying to openly make a union push at this moment. Likewise, if you're a union shop but your union leadership isn't amenable to breaking with management to coordinate a general strike with other unions, maybe you need to start talking about a union within a union. Organize the workers who do see the bigger picture. Communicate with other organized workers doing the same. And get ready to disregard and overthrow your recognized leadership when the time is right and the contradictions are heightened enough for it to be necessary. Build a shadow leadership committee to this effect. One that can coordinate your efforts to recruit other members to your cause while maintaining secrecy. And then in the event of the strike action, you'll know exactly who needs to do the talking. And consider other kinds of organization outside the workplace. You've got your classic, though often derided, revolutionary reading groups. Get people reading the works of others who have engaged in mass organization and revolutions and discuss these ideas and tactics together. One thing we've tried here in LJ that seems to work pretty well is something we call teaching circle, which is like a reading group, but where a couple of people per meeting give a presentation on something pertinent that they've read, and then open the floor up to discussion. I don't think it's quite as effective at deepening knowledge as having everyone read the same book, but it's a great tool for recruitment. A reading group becomes inherently exclusive as you get deeper into the book, and jumping in for a new person will become impossible. But Teaching Circle is always accessible to new members and visitors who might be interested. Stacking these tactics so you get a mix of both seems like the way to go. These kinds of groups are essential to heightening consciousness for organizers and groups who can spread these ideas among the masses, but your reading group is not going to be the backbone of mass organization in your community. Join or build a reading group and then tie that group directly into action as soon as possible, especially when it comes to preparing for the material demands of a general strike. Take your readers to the local food bank. Take them to the warming shelters that will be opening as winter approaches. Take them to protests and get them talking to the people there. many of whom are desperately looking for something more to do than just hold a sign. Collaborate with other like-minded groups, obviously, but be willing to broaden your perspective of who that might include. In particular, there are hardly any non-government organizations more organized than churches and other religious institutions. Obviously, a lot of churches don't have much of a problem with the things the government is doing, because the Christian nationalist elements of the administration are doing exactly what some churches think the government should be doing. But there are some churches and congregations who are really committed to living by the Beatitudes and by the Book of James and other progressive cornerstones of the gospel. And because that's how these kinds of Christians see the Bible, you're pretty likely to find them active at places like your local food bank or soup kitchen. We need to be in those spaces anyway, so take stock of the organizations represented in these community relief and mutual aid spaces and see if there are deeper connections to be made there. And if you're this kind of Christian yourself, you know your own church. Are the pastor and clergy and deacons in your church liable to support some resistance to fascism? If so, you can go ahead and try to prepare as a congregation and figure out what y'all are able and willing to do. Some progressive churches will be willing to get active. Think about MLK's Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the direct action that they provided during the Civil Rights Movement, or the Catholics who have followed liberation theology in their churches in Latin America, who provided support to resistance movements against dictatorships there. Some churches won't be willing to risk the negative exposure of taking an active posture in fear of retaliation or dividing the congregation. Tread lightly and consider following the same kind of method I outlined for unions with unsupportive leadership. Use your congregation to recruit first, and consider what you might be able to do to commandeer the ship if things get rough enough and you need to open up the church's resources to the community. And of course, this message isn't just for Christians. All this applies to every kind of religious institution, be it a mosque or a synagogue or what have you. And all y'all got more to lose from a Christian theocracy than the Christians, so I do reckon that organizing in those places should be easier than it would be in a lot of churches. Students have always tended to play a crucial role in popular mass movements, so college folks and even high schoolers start meeting after school. Connect existing organizations on campus and build up the most unified front that you can. Make newspapers and pamphlets to help persuade your classmates. And establish a presence on campus, setting up tables and places for open discussion. Show your strength in numbers. Find your allies in the faculty and administration and learn how to use their positions of authority on campus to benefit the movement. This is especially important when it comes to the kinds of off-hours access you have to campus for meetings and events, which can heighten the consciousness of the students. And some of your teachers were active on their campuses when they were in school. Figure out which of them has the knowledge and experience and the willingness to guide you. Beyond that, know your neighborhood. Get to know your neighbors now so you can prepare to work with them, especially in the event of a general strike, when resources will get stretched and we'll really have to depend on the people close to us. Know who the doomers and preppers are. Some of them are good people who will want to be able to help if things reach a breaking point. But some of them are the biggest dangers to your community. Because not only do they not care about anyone but those in their own household, some of them seem itching to turn on their community in the event of a crisis. Anybody remember Alex Jones saying he would eat his neighbors? Houses like that should be marked and treated like your own local Harper's Ferry if you're picking up what I'm putting down here. And get creative. Technological change was what helped Nkrumah get the message out to rural parts of Ghana. And that's what organization was built on. One of our biggest problems is the saturation of technology and media, which is isolating people in their own little rabbit holes and echo chambers, making it harder to tie people together into a strong, indivisible group. How do we break out of that and get a large group of people on the same page in spite of that? How can we exploit technology to build strength? Answering this might be the key to everything here. I've pulled extensively from C.L.R. James' book, Nkrumah and the Ghana Revolution in this episode. So if you want to know more about the backstory for this episode, you should definitely go grab a copy of that. And there'll be a lot more book recommendations in the description as well. I might do a live stream or something as a follow-up to this episode so we can talk more about books, articles, and podcasts that bring some of these ideas about organization into greater clarity. But for now, start thinking like Nkrumah. Who are our market women and our lorry drivers and our servicemen's union? Or in other words, what existing institutions and organizations do we have that we can start from instead of reinventing the wheel? What independent media do we have talking past each other right now? And how can we fixate their attention to push the public discourse in one direction. Start thinking about what kind of roles you can play in this, from hosting meetings to writing and speaking polemically and building up reserves of resources for when we need them later. We can win, we will win, and we must win. It's just a question of how, and luckily we have a lot of amazing examples from the past to emulate.
This has been a presentation of New LJ Television. Visit us online at newlj.tv.